Some of us can relate better to one verse of that song than others. And all different points in our life, right? Yeah. So we're going to continue Joseph's story here. We jump ahead, and I'm going to give you the cliff notes in the sermon of what happened in between. This is toward the end of this story. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of the Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Got to remember what they had done to him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. Can you envision that scene? They're just kind of stiffly inching closer, like, what is he going to do to us? And they came closer, and he said, "I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." God sent me before you to preserve life. "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord over all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. This is one of the most famous stories. Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Some people know it. But that story was a story long before the musical. We all experience times in our life when we think we've done all the right things. We think we have. We've given our hearts to Christ. We've worshiped and we've been faithful to God. And then things go horribly, horribly wrong. For me, that time came shortly after I said yes to following God's call into ministry. I told you it took 15 years for that finally to come to pass. And when I had finally come to the point where I felt confident that if this was what God was calling me to do, then God would make it possible. If God brought me to it, then God would help me through it. Shortly after I had given my notice to the school that I was leaving teaching and I had enrolled in seminary, Tom was downsized in a corporate merger. Gone was that large income that I thought was going to safely see us through the next 3 years. Then in December, our son John suffered a compound fracture in his foot, which required surgery. There went that Christmas break. In May came the diagnosis of Tom's inoperable throat cancer. That summer, while he was in treatment with chemo and radiation, an oak tree next to the house let loose of a couple large branches that came crashing onto and into our historic home, sending shards of non-tempered glass into the walls and into the furniture. it was a good thing no one was in that room. Talk about a pit of despair. My heart sank once again, wondering what on earth we did to deserve this. If God loved us and we were following God's will for our lives, what on earth was going on? Why was all this bad stuff happening to us? Some would say that Satan was tempting us to turn away from God's path. Others just called it really bad luck. But we remain faithful to that path. And dozens, literally dozens of people helped us in 1,000 different ways. We were broke, but not broken. We were hurting, but healing. Frustrated, but faithful. Joseph's story has always been an inspiration. No matter what happened to him, he was faithful to God and used the gifts of wisdom and discernment and the interpretation of dreams in whatever setting he found himself. Now, yes, when at first he was that cocky teenager, 17 years old, and his dream interpretation got him in hot water with his family. Jealous brothers conspired to kill Joseph. He's thrown into that pit rather than killed outright. Then when the brother who objected to killing him is away tending to the flock, go away, Aunt. Shoo, shoo. The other brothers throw him in that pit and sell him into slavery, where Joseph's taken off to Egypt. Now, when Reuben returns from tending the flock and discovers what has happened, they falsify the evidence. They tell their father, Jacob, otherwise known as Israel, after wrestling with God, that a wild animal has killed his beloved son, Joseph. Now, Jacob is distraught. He grieves so hard. Meanwhile, the slave traders take Joseph to Egypt and they sell him to Potiphar, who is the captain of the Pharaoh's guard. In chapter 39, we're told that all the while the Lord was with Joseph as he worked in the Potiphar's house. And Joseph became a successful young man. Joseph's master noticed that he had that golden touch. Everything he did turned out well. It seemed to prosper. So that brought him favor, and therefore he's put in turn. He's made overseer of the entire household and put in charge. So Joseph, he's grown to be quite successful and handsome too. This attracts the attention of his master's wife, who tries to seduce him. And unlike what today's young men are encouraged by the popular culture to do, Joseph does not tap that. Instead, he told her no, that he would not sin against God and his master by committing adultery. So one day, she entraps Joseph. House is quiet, everybody else is gone. She corners him, grabs a hold of his garment, and he flees. And the garment's still in her hand. Well, her face is red. She's angry. She's embarrassed. So she makes up a story that accuses him of improper behavior and gets Joseph thrown in the slammer. Okay. While in jail, Joseph gains favor with the chief jailer. Say that one 10 times fast. And he's put in charge of caring for all the other inmates. As before, everything Joseph did seems to prosper. Now, when Joseph is able to accurately interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh's cupbearer and chief baker who'd been thrown in jail for a few days, Joseph asks them to please remember him when they get out of prison. In other words, put in a good word for me. They get out, but they totally forget. Joseph is never mentioned, at least not for a good long time. So poor Joseph spends 2 more years, 2 years in jail. It is about then that the Pharaoh has this troublesome recurring dream that none of his magicians or wise men are able to interpret for him. It's about then that Pharaoh's cupbearer finally remembers, oh yeah, remember I had a dream in jail, and there was this guy named Joseph, and he was able to interpret it for me. So they send for him. Joseph's cleaned up, gets shaved, brought to the Pharaoh, and Joseph agrees to interpret his dream for him, but he assures him that it is God that will give Pharaoh the favorable answer that he seeks, not him. In the dream, God is telling Pharaoh that there will be 7 years of prosperous, plentiful harvest, followed by 7 years of famine that will totally consume the land. Everything, dry as a bone, nothing can be planted or grown. So instructions in this dream are given for selecting a wise man to oversee the land of Egypt, and a plan for setting aside reserves in the good times that will get Egypt through the famine and provide for all, saving for the not rainy day, as the case may be. Since Joseph obviously had the Spirit of God with him and wisely interpreted this dream, he is chosen to oversee Egypt and to work this plan. Joseph goes instantly from being a poor guy who's languished in jail for years to now being this incredibly powerful and wealthy man. He's told by Pharaoh, Pharaoh says, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift a hand or a foot in all the land of Egypt. That's a lot of power. All this and a beautiful young wife to boot, when Joseph is just 30 years old. So, from the age of 17, when he was thrown into that pit by his jealous brothers, it took till he was 30 for all of this to turn around. Just as the dream foretold, the years of plenty happened and the famine came to pass in Egypt and all over the world. When the people ran out of food, Joseph was ready, and there was bread in Egypt. So people came from far and wide to buy food, including Joseph's brothers who'd been sent there by their father, Jacob. Imagine, if you will, the anger that Joseph might have felt, both anger and fear in that moment when his brothers betrayed him and sold him into slavery. Imagine what kind of a burden he could have carried all those years at what his brothers did, all that time he spent in jail. But he didn't. He didn't. Joseph stayed faithful to God, trusting in God's love for him, and faithful to observing the way of being that he knew God hoped for all of God's people. The story goes on in chapters 42 to 44 with Joseph, unrecognized to his brothers, playing kind of a cat and mouse game with them. Delighted to see his family is alive and well, especially hearing that his little brother Benjamin, with whom he shares a biological mother, but not yet revealing his true identity. When Joseph conspires to keep Benjamin with him, the others respond by telling him they'd rather die than cause more grief to their father, who had already lost a favored son. It's then that Joseph can't hold back any longer. He reveals his identity. He is overcome by emotion. And as you can imagine, his brothers are standing stone silent, shocked to learn that this is their brother Joseph, who they probably assume by now is long since dead. He's not dead, he's alive and well. Not only that, he's the most powerful man in their world. He holds their lives in the palm of his hand, able to give life or take it. And he seems to have forgiven them completely. How can this be? They had been so consumed by petty jealousy. And yet he's forgiven them completely because he realized that it was God It was God that was at work in all their lives. God sent me before you to preserve life, Joseph told them. And as God sent him away from the family in a most unlikely method, God had used Joseph to preserve God's people. God's ways are often impossible for us to comprehend. Bad things happen to good people, and we're so eager for a resolution that we want things fixed now, and we want everything to be just right. We want it perfect right now. Often when those bad things happen, we blame God, and we think that God must not be loving, or maybe he's not all-powerful after all. Otherwise, why would these bad things happen? Our anger and our hurt clouds our vision. But that's not how God works. We cannot manipulate God. God's time frame is not our time frame. God's lessons often are difficult and even painful, but they are meant for a greater good. As all those bad things happened during my years in seminary, the only thing to be done was to keep our heads down and move forward. Prayer helped. God's emissaries helped. Being faithful to the path helped. And I confess, yes, there were times when we were far from perfect. Just like that one verse of the song we just sang. We struggled. We struggled in our relationship. But in the end, we made it through. It took a long time. It took the counsel of mentors and counselors and lots of hard work, but we survived. And we learned a whole lot along the way. We learned to be able to be compassionate with those who are broke and on the verge of feeling broken. We learned to have faith when there's nothing outwardly worthy of having hope in. Everyone experiences dark nights of the soul, times when we feel like God has forgotten us or left us entirely. But if we can remain faithful and trust in God's providence, in God's power to bring us through the darkness and into the light again, we will see that God was there the whole time. God was there. Along the way, we learn lessons that we can share with others, with our brothers and sisters in Christ, in their hour of need, helping them. Hopefully, those lessons will help them see God's goodness at work in their lives, too. Joseph bloomed everywhere he was planted. Whether in jail or managing a household or running a country, he listened to God, kept his head down, and prayed. We need to do just that, just like that. Go where you are led. Use the gifts that you're given and those abilities that we've been given for the sake of God's kingdom. He doesn't give us all those gifts just for our own wealth or benefit. They're there for the purpose of God's church, God's kingdom, God's will for the world. Don't be seduced by the world that would draw you into ways of living that are not healthy. Listen. Follow God's instructions. Love others along the way Christ loves you. And know that it's going to be okay. You can trust in God. Amen.